The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the room was the awkward silence. My in-laws, Julia and Derek, sat across from me, both staring, waiting for me to speak. "The mortgage is $5,000 a month," Julia finally said. "You can handle that, right, Hannah?" She smiled as though she were discussing a simple favor, not a crippling financial burden. My heart raced. "What?" I asked, my voice a little louder than I intended. Julia recoiled dramatically, clutching her chest. "Oh no, don't shout. You're scaring me," she said with a fake tremor in her voice. Derek, her husband, and my father-in-law just glared at me. "It's only fair," he said. "We're not working. You're successful. What's $5,000 to you?" I was speechless, sitting frozen in my chair. How had it come to this? Let me take you back to when things were simpler. My name is Hannah, and I married Matthew just a few months ago. We were newlyweds, full of hope and excitement for the future. We decided to live in a place halfway between our families, close enough to visit, but not too close to get overwhelmed by family drama. Or so we thought. Matthew had warned me early on that his relationship with his parents wasn't great. "They're reckless with money," he said one night while we were still dating. "They don't have much common sense, to be honest. I wouldn't mind cutting ties." But I couldn't understand it then. They were his parents, after all, and parents should be respected. My own parents were loving and supportive, so I naively thought it couldn't be that bad with his. I first met Julia and Derek when Matthew and I got engaged. We decided to pay them a visit at their house, a modest suburban home. Matthew had already warned me not to expect too much warmth, but when we arrived, Julia greeted us with a smile and open arms. She seemed pleasant enough, and although she was a bit cold toward me, I brushed it off as typical mother-in-law behavior. We sat down to chat, and things were going smoothly until Derek asked me where I worked. I mentioned the company I was employed at, a well-known and successful business, and suddenly, everything changed. Their faces lit up as though I had just given them the best news of their lives. From that moment, the lukewarm welcome turned into excitement. "We have a wonderful daughter-in-law," Julia exclaimed, clapping her hands. They became overly kind, their earlier indifference completely forgotten. It was almost unsettling how quickly their attitudes shifted. On the way home, Matthew was unusually quiet. After a while, he finally spoke. "Be careful around my parents," he said. "I've seen that look in their eyes before." I didn't understand what he meant at the time, but I nodded anyway, brushing it off. How bad could it really be? I had no idea that this would be the start of something much darker. A few weeks into our marriage, I started receiving phone calls from Julia. At first, it was innocent enough. "Hannah, could you come over for a bit? There's something I want to discuss." I thought nothing of it and agreed to visit. One hot afternoon, after a long day at work, I got one of those calls. It was urgent, or so it seemed. "Hannah, please come over right away. We need to talk," Julia said, before abruptly hanging up. Worried that something might have happened, I rushed over in the sweltering summer heat. When I arrived, drenched in sweat, Julia greeted me with her usual warm smile. "Thank you for coming, dear. Please, come in and have a seat." She handed me a cup of coffee, her smile never fading. I sat down, confused, wondering what was so important that she needed me here right away. My in-laws sat across from me, sharing an excited glance before Derek pulled out a laptop and placed it in front of me. "I'm sorry," I said, "but what's going on?" "We need you to buy something for us," Derek said casually, as though it were a small favor. "Buy something?" I repeated, confused. Julia nodded enthusiastically as Derek opened the laptop, revealing a page filled with images of luxury handbags and designer watches. "Yes, a few things for us," she said. I blinked, stunned. "You want me to buy these for you?" I asked, trying to make sense of the request. "Of course," Julia replied, her tone light. "You work for a big company. You can afford it." The smile on her face was unnerving. Before I could process what was happening, Derek chimed in. "It's the least you could do. After all, we gave you our son." I was speechless. They were serious. The pressure continued. I tried to refuse, but they pushed harder. Julia's smile faded, and Derek's expression hardened, We welcomed you into our family, Derek said sternly. It's only right that you show some gratitude. Their words hit me like a ton of bricks. I didn't know what to say. I was overwhelmed, trapped. And so, without fully understanding why, I gave in. I bought the luxury items they had asked for. As soon as I made the purchases, their smiles returned. Thank you so much. Zrenia, Hana, Julia beamed. You've made us so happy. But I didn't feel happy. I felt used. After that day, things only got worse. The requests kept coming. Every week, it seemed like there was something new they wanted me to buy. I tried to refuse. I really did. But each time, they would guilt-trip me into giving in. Julia would tear up, Derek would scold me, and I would find myself caving, handing over more and more money. It became unbearable. I felt like I was being crushed under the weight of their constant demands, but I couldn't bring myself to tell Matthew. He was already stressed from work, and I didn't want to add to his problems. Besides, I wasn't sure how he would react. Then came the day that changed everything. I had just finished a long day at work when I received another call from Julia. This time, her tone was different, more urgent. Hannah, come over immediately, she said before hanging up without waiting for a response. Dreading what new requests they had in store, I made my way to their house once again. But when I arrived, it wasn't the usual luxury items they wanted. Instead, Derek handed me a stack of papers. What's this? I asked, my voice trembling. Our living expenses, Derek said bluntly. We thought you could take care of it for us. I stared at the papers in disbelief. It was a detailed breakdown of their monthly bills, groceries, utilities, rent, all neatly calculated. The total was staggering. I can't, I whispered, shaking my head. This is too much. I shouldn't have to cover your living expenses. As soon as the words left my mouth, I knew I had made a mistake. Julia's face twisted in fury, and she burst into tears, sobbing loudly. How could you be so cruel? She wailed. We're your family. How could you turn your back on us like this? Derek, his face red with anger, shouted, People send money to their parents all the time. It's your duty as our daughter-in-law. The room spun around me. I felt trapped, suffocated by their relentless demands. And once again, I gave in. I handed over the money, hating myself for doing it, but unable to stop. As I walked home that evening, I made a decision. I couldn't keep doing this. I needed to talk to Matthew. But when I got home, I found him sitting in the dark, staring blankly at the floor. Matthew? I asked softly. What's wrong? He looked up at me, his eyes tired and distant. I've been laid off, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart sank. Matthew had been having problems at work for months, but I never expected this. He had always been so hardworking, so determined. How could this have happened? I sat down beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. It's going to be okay, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. We sat in silence for a while, neither of us knowing what to say. How could I tell him about his parents now? How could I burden him with that when he had just lost his job? Weeks passed, and I continued to receive calls from Julia and Derek, but I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was barely holding it together as it was, and I knew that if I went back to their house, I would only be forced to give in again. Then, one day, I received a message from Julia. Hannah, we need to talk. Meet us at this address. It wasn't their home. Curious and wary, I looked up the address on my phone. It was a mansion, a massive house in a wealthy neighborhood. What was going on? Despite my better judgment, I went. When I arrived, I was greeted by the sight of Julia, standing in front of the mansion with a wide smile on her face. Welcome, she said, gesturing for me to come inside. I stepped into the grand foyer, my heart pounding in my chest. Whose house is this? I asked. It's ours, Julia replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I was stunned. How did you afford this? I asked. We took out a loan, Derek said casually as he joined us in the living room. Even at our age, we found someone willing to lend us the money. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They had taken out a massive loan for this mansion, despite not having any way to pay it back. The mortgage is $5,000 a month, Derek continued, smiling. But you can handle that, right? My head spun. No, I said firmly, standing up. I can't. This is too much. Julia's face fell, her eyes wide with fake shock. Oh, don't be so harsh, Hannah. We're family. I won't do it, I said, my voice shaking. This is your responsibility, not mine. Without another word, I turned and walked out the door, ignoring their calls for me to come back. My hands trembled as I got into my car, my heart racing. I had finally stood up to them. When I got home, I rushed to Matthew, who was sitting at his computer. Matthew, I said, my voice cracking. We need to talk. He looked up, surprised by the urgency in my tone. What's wrong? I broke down, sobbing as I explained everything. How his parents had been pressuring me for months. How I had been giving them money, how they had just asked me to cover a $5,000 mortgage for a mansion they couldn't afford. Matthew listened quietly, his face growing darker with every word. When I finished, he sighed heavily. I knew they were bad, but I didn't think they'd go this far. Matthew sat in silence for a moment before finally speaking. We need to get away from them, he said. If we stay here, they'll keep finding ways to manipulate us. I nodded, wiping away my tears. But how? They know where we live. They know where I work. We'll move, Matthew said decisively. We'll change our numbers, cut off all contact. If they don't know where we are, they can't reach us. It was a bold plan, but it was the only way. We couldn't keep living like this. So, over the next few weeks, we prepared to leave. We found a new place overseas, far away from Julia and Derek. I quit my job, and Matthew, who had been working on a side project online, decided to go full-time with his business. The day we left, we changed our phone numbers and disappeared from their lives completely. For months, everything was peaceful. Matthew's business took off, and we were able to live comfortably on his income alone. We built a new life, free from the constant demands of his parents. But then, one day, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me, and I answered. Hannah? A familiar voice said on the other end. It was Julia. My heart skipped a beat. How had she found me? Please, Hannah, you've got to help us, she pleaded, her voice trembling. We're in trouble. We borrowed money from someone bad. They're threatening us. If we don't pay, we'll be forced into something terrible. I stood frozen, the phone pressed against my ear. What do you want from me? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Just $30,000, Julia sobbed. If you send us that, we can get out of this. Please, Hannah. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to help them, but the desperation in her voice was real. I walked over to Matthew, put the phone on speaker, and let him hear the conversation. When Julia finished her plea, Matthew spoke firmly. No, he said. We're done with you. Julia cried harder. Please, Matthew, we'll die if you don't help us. But Matthew was unmoved. You've taken enough from us, he said coldly. You'll have to deal with this on your own. That was the last we ever heard from them. I don't know what happened to Julia and Derek after that, and honestly, I don't care. They made their choices, and they had to live with the consequences. As for Matthew and me, we've never been happier. We built a beautiful home abroad, and we're expecting our first child soon. For the first time in years, we're free from the burden of his parents' demands. And as we prepare for the arrival of our little one, I know that we'll never let anyone take advantage of us again. Because family doesn't mean control. Family doesn't mean manipulation. And now we finally have the peace we deserve.